Okay, so the subject of the chapter starts with obligations of people that lease out land, both the lessees and the owner of the land. And I thought it'd be interesting. First of all, it's a very interesting chapter, and it'll take us probably through several decades of study. I mean, it's a very interesting, complicated chapter. It's not so complicated, but I mean, a lot of different issues come up. I thought it'd be interesting to start now as we come to Sukkot, because it's an elaboration of all the agricultural legislation that's in the Torah, which is relevant nowadays as we go to the Sukkot. And then, but it expands beyond just agricultural laws, and it becomes some very interesting laws. It becomes the basis for Jewish laws on employee relationships and the relationship between employer and employees, and contracts between employer and employees. This actually is the chapter. We won't get there for a while, but this is the chapter that most develops those relationships in Jewish law. Mostly because you'll see it starts with the idea of leasing land. So leasing land is an old concept. You have it in the Torah too, where a landowner will lease the land to, kind of serf, where you pay the landowner in produce. So you do the work, and the landowner gets the produce and gets the capital from you, and you get to keep some of it. So that's an old relationship, and essentially then the person who is leasing the land becomes a kind of employee of the landowner. And even though that's not how they define the relationship at first, that's essentially what's happening. You're doing the work on behalf of the landowner. So there are rules about how much money he has to pay you and how much you work. Now, of course, there were just plain workers in those days too, and somebody who's leasing land can also hire a worker, a wage worker. So this is a different type of wages, though, where you're actually sitting on the land and you're doing all the work for the land, but someone else owns the land. It's interesting because it's an ancient practice. It kind of gets us into relationships between employers and employees. Also, the idea of leases still exists, leases and lessees. When we lease all sorts of things, and we have obligations as lessees, and this kind of relationship right now, like a serfdom, doesn't exist in America, but you'll see there's similarities to things. I was just going over the chapter really quickly. I noticed all sorts of things that we do today that are similar, and how there are ethical issues that come up that are important. So if you look on the page 139 there, you see these are the main verses that the chapter will take up. And most of this stuff is oppression of workers. You can just look at it really quickly. There's things about lending and not lending, and much of this material we won't get to for at least a couple of weeks. All right. I think I'm going to start though. Page 141. This is the Mishnah. It'll take us a while to get used to this vocabulary too. There's a specific vocabulary for these transactions, but we'll get it. Even the first word, hamekabel sadeh mechavero, you receive a field from another person. So receiving there means you're leasing the field. If it was acquiring, it would be a different word, like lakachat or buying or selling. But it says receiving. So receiving means that the field is under your domain, but the other person still owns it. So it becomes a landowner. Hamekabel sadeh mechavero makom shenagdu liktsor yiktsor. In the place where, so a lot of this starts with absent any explicit contract. Then you go to local custom. Okay. By the way, an explicit contract, it's important to understand this too. So an explicit contract will almost always overrule local custom. But a lot of this has to do with absent explicit language in the contract itself, makom. So makom is the place, shenagu liktsor, in the place where these serfs, I'll call them serfs. I mean, it wasn't even an insult in those days. I mean, where the serf's job, responsibility was just to liktsor is to cut with a scythe. Okay, so just to cut the grain. Then that's what you can expect them to do. La'akor means to uproot, right? So the place where it's the custom for the serf or the worker on the field to uproot the crop, la'akor, yakor, you should uproot it. What's the difference, by the way? It's just.
What's the bush cutting it? One pulling out the roots.
Yeah. So what's harder to do?
Pulling out.
So it's more onerous on the worker to pull it out by the root. there's other differences too, practical differences too. Has to do with what's left behind, what's not left behind. Okay, what's cleaner for the field, what's not. Just to give it away, in case none of you are farmers that have ever worked with a scythe before. So a scythe is much less clean. You're going to leave a lot of stuff lying around. Whereas uprooting, which is harder to do and which is much slower, you're not going to leave as much behind.
It's also protecting the landowner, how he wants the land. I mean, you go and uproot everything, he's finished next year.
Yeah. Yeah. First of all, not necessarily, because I think there's some crops that you do uproot, yes, and you replant. But when I get into farming, my expertise starts to go way down. But I think most of you are in the same. My expertise is what I read in the Talmud, but it's like 3rd century farming. But what else was I going to say? Oh, yeah. But the thing is that the landowner, you can see both the landowner and the serf have to be explicit in the contract. Like if he doesn't want you to uproot, and you're in a place where the custom is for the serf to uproot, then the landowner should have put it in the contract. You're going to see that's going to be an issue all through this. Then you should have put it in the contract. Otherwise, all we can do is look at local practice. And local practice is interesting. Do we have that in law still? I don't know. I mean, it's something that develops over a very long time. Otherwise, how else would you call it local practice? Right. Okay. Lacharosh acharav yacharosh. And if it's the custom and it's not in the contract to plow and plant afterwards, then the worker is expected to do that. Hakol can mean hagamidina. Everything relies on the local custom, the custom of the Medina, which here is not the government itself, but the province, the area. Kishem shecholkim batfua, kach cholkim betevenu v'kash. Okay, so whatever percentage arrangement you've worked out for produce, because that's how this stuff works. I, as the serf on the field, the worker on the field, I keep 20%, you, the landowner, get 80%. Okay, so whatever you work out for produce, that's what you also might work out for straw or for other kind of leavings, right? Because those things actually could be worth something also.
Sure.
For example, we just had to purchase schach. For who wants schach? I mean, schach is just branches, but people use straw for stuff, and so it's not just going to be right. It's going to be worth a lot less, but it's going to be worth something.
Right.
So if you say 30% of all doesn't just means the apples that are in the orchard, but it also means whatever is like the straw, anything that's worth anything. So don't think just because you're the serf on the land, you get 100% of the leavings, because those also belong to the owner. So whatever percentage you worked out for the produce itself, that also applies to the other stuff too, which also has a value. Is that clear? Okay.
I do have a question.
Yes.
The asor, the 10% that has to go to the temple, whose liability is it? The renter, the owner, or both?
The owner.
Yeah. It's his land.
It's the
owner. So the owner has to give it from his 20%?
Yeah.
Whatever the agreement is?
No, it goes. It's 10%, but yeah, it comes out of the owners. It comes out of the owners.
The owner portion.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Kishem shechochim beyayin. Okay, so just like you would split up if it's a vineyard. Okay, and also these are different kinds of fields. The readers of the Talmud would understand implicitly the different types of the fields and the different kind of agriculture. So we have to do a little research on Wikipedia, but. They didn't have Wikipedia, so that's our advantage is we have Wikipedia. Their advantage, they actually were farmers, right. So they knew what they were talking about. But you set up a vineyard very differently. So the way that you would divide the wine or the grapes, the produce of a vineyard, so those are branches, and also there are things that you plant in a vineyard. How does he translate them? Canes. So you plant canes in order to support the vines.
Right.
You actually plant those things. I mean, nowadays I suppose you could use wood planks, but those days they actually would plant cane, in order to support. And those things would be worth money. Like a cane could be worth it's like straw. I don't think it was sugar cane, but it was something that could be worth something. And so the main produce, of course, is the grapes and the wine that come out of it. But you also have to divide up the ancillary stuff, which has some worth. And they both supply, because you need these things to support the grapes. You both have to supply together. So you don't have to expect the landowner by himself to supply the canes that are going to support the grapes, but also the worker doesn't have to supply them all. They come out with an arrangement where they split. They both supply it because it's necessary. And it takes some work. Okay. Are any questions? All right, well, that's the Mishnah. You can see the Mishnah is very much reliant on local custom. And, I'll just go right to the Gemara. Yeah, that's a good question, yeah. Yeah. So let's look at the Gemara for that. I mean, why? Because this is like unlike a lot of Mishnahs, there's a lot of stuff here that's obvious. Whereas they could just say, for instance, just follow local custom. There's a lot they spell out that seems like they don't need to spell out. And so the question is, what's the larger point they're aiming at? And so one larger point, obviously, is the importance of local custom absent a contract, because people are sometimes sloppy in contracts or they're in a hurry. Here's my land. Do the 30%. It just says 30%. So then the rabbis have to come in and have to explain, well, 30% there, since you didn't say it in the contract, is also going to include the straw and the other stuff, but also it's going to follow local custom in terms of the way the guy's going to work the field. And so a lot of this just encourages us to make sure we're careful in our contracts if we want something spelled out. So now you'll see in the Gemara they talk about all sorts of assumptions you may enter into in a very simple contract, which may be faulty. So you always have to fall back on local custom. Okay, Tana. So page 142. Everybody there? Okay. Makom shenagu litzor eino rashai lakor. So this is a teaching, and it states the Mishnah in slightly different language. In a place where it's customary to cut with a sickle, you are not allowed to uproot. Okay. Also, in a place of la'akor, eino rashai latzor. So in a place where the custom is to uproot, you're not allowed just to use a sickle. Okay, that's different than the Mishnah. You could interpret the Mishnah that way, but the Mishnah just says you follow local custom. This says that you're not allowed to deviate from local custom. Okay, now the question is, what if it's in the contract to deviate from local custom? And we'll get to that. But for now, keep in mind, so if the local custom is just to cut, then you're not allowed to uproot. And if the local custom is to uproot, then you're not allowed to cut. So just take a second. We don't have to do this all the time. Is there an advantage to either? Let's say you're the landowner, or let's say you're the worker. Is there an advantage to either?
It depends on the crop.
Yes, it depends on the crop. So in certain crops, it's certainly an advantage to uproot because you get the whole crop. Okay. If you're a worker, the advantage, it seems to me, is always to cut. If you're a hired worker, it's because it's easier. Now, if you get a percentage, then maybe you want to go to the trouble of la'akor, of uprooting, so you get the whole thing. But in terms of back-breaking labor, even I know it's harder to uproot than it is to just to cut with a sickle. Okay, so my point is that you can see comparative advantages to either, and there might be preferences for either. Okay, now ushnehem ma'akvim ze'etzeh, and in either the worker or the landowner can prevent the other from doing what's not local custom. So if local custom was to uproot, and I see you uprooting, I am legally allowed to stop you from doing that. And now what they're going to say is because both the worker and the landowner may have a genuine interest in one or the other, and now they have to play that out. Okay. Liktsor eino rashai la'akor. Okay, so to cut, you're not allowed to uproot because the owner could say, "Hi, Amar." Ba'inan ditvan li ri. So because the owner could say, I don't want you to uproot because I need the messy straw that's left over, because that fertilizes my field. Since the owner has a legitimate claim, it makes some sense. You're not allowed. You might say to yourself, look, I'm doing you a favor, Mr. Owner. I'm uprooting, and by uprooting, I'm giving you more valuable crop. So you're not allowed to do that in a place where that's not the custom, because the owner could say back. I'm not saying the owner does, but the owner could have a claim. No, maybe I wanted that fertilizer because there is a benefit to me. So therefore, stick to local custom. Don't do me any favors. Stick to local custom because I may have a genuine. Even if you think you're doing me a favor, since the local custom is just to do it cut, there's still the possibility the owner wants it that way. Okay, so this kind of gets into you don't try to do the owner any favors, or you don't try to do the worker any favors. You follow local custom, even if you're thinking in your head, hey, I could be doing the owner a favor. Follow local custom, and we can think of all sorts of examples in our own life. I took your kid for a haircut. I saved you some time. Well, no, I didn't want. The babysitter could say that. I didn't want that haircut because I've got another guy that gives me haircuts for free and didn't save me any time because I wasn't planning on it. So don't do what I don't tell you to do, even if you're doing me a favor. That's kind of what they're getting at there. What? Yeah. I shouldn't have changed the subject. Sorry.
Rabbi, some crops, depending on where the harvest product is, if it's like onions or beets, it's in the root.
Right.
If it's a grain,
well, then you better put that in the contract. You better, right? I mean, you better tell them, I need you to uproot it.
If you're doing beets, I want the whole.
Yeah, but in that case, I mean, the local custom is going to be to uproot. I mean, if it's a beet fields, so it's not going to be the issue. These issues are things where it's not obvious. Okay, and then the opposite would be true to V'hayamar. The worker could say, because the worker could say lo matzina. The worker could say, you expected me to uproot, but my understanding was in your town here, workers don't uproot. And even though it may have been to my benefit to uproot because I would get the money more, I had no intention ever of uprooting. So therefore, and it's too hard. It's hard to do. So frankly, I wouldn't have taken this on if I thought the idea was to uproot. Because even though it makes more money for me, it's just too backbreaking labor. I can't do it. So you can't assume that you know the other person's financial benefit more than they do. They are entering into a contract which makes sense to them. You assume they know local custom, and you don't do them any favors. Okay, and they are allowed to say this is too much work, even though you'll pay me more. It's too much work. Okay, it's like I had a cantor a long time ago that we offered to pay more to do Torah readings, and he was, and we were amazed that he said no. He didn't want to change. It wasn't in his contract, and he felt like he was going to tire his voice out in doing the Torah readings, and it was legitimate for him to say no because although it would have made him more money, and from my perspective, it was doing him a favor, and also it didn't seem like that taxing on the voice. It's actually not up to me to decide that. I mean, it was in the contract, and he can decide like don't do me any favors. And there's not any way that I could force him to do it because it wasn't in the contract. So something similar.
You think there was any way?
Rehire him.
Yeah, but in some ways that wouldn't be proper either. I mean, if I want a Torah reader, you put it in the contract. I mean, that's the.
Do you think that they were written contracts at this point?
Yeah, I do. There were written contracts.
There were what?
Written contracts. Yeah, there were. I mean, they probably weren't the 500-page things we have nowadays. But
they didn't have enough lawyers.
Right. No, they're lawyers. They were lawyers for sure. But one of the oldest professions. Yeah. All right. La'akor, so number 5 on page 142. La'akor eino rashai liktzor. So now it just goes backward. If the custom is to uproot, so now the custom is to uproot, you are not allowed to insist on just the cutting. Either way, the landowner or the worker himself. Because hayamar, because the landowner could say, ba'ina detinaker arai. Because the worker could say, no, I didn't want you to liktzor, just to cut the stuff. Because I actually wanted my field to be cleared. I wanted it to be completely clean. So because the worker might even think I'm doing him a favor, because if I uproot, like Irv said, there won't be a plant, so I'm going to do you a favor. I'm going to uproot completely, even though it's more work for me. And then the owner can say, no, I didn't want it. No, I'm sorry, the other way. The owner can say, I wanted, even though I make less money because I don't get the straw and stuff like that, I wanted my field cleared. And that was my assumption going into, and that's what we do here. So don't do me any favors by just cutting. Okay. The hayamar, and the worker could say, ba'ina tivna. The worker could say, even though it was harder work for me, I needed the straw. So don't think that you were saving me the work by telling me not to do it that way. I came and did this job in this town because that I knew that I would get extra straw that way. Okay. Ushnehem makvim ze'al zeh. Okay. Now this is a teaching that either can prevent the other. Okay. Now the question you have there in the Talmud is lamali. Why do you have that phrase? So you don't actually need that phrase because as soon as you say you're not allowed, you actually don't need the phrase that one can prevent the other. You're not allowed. It says in a place where you can cut, you're not allowed to uproot. So once you say you're not allowed, you don't actually need the phrase one can prevent the other. It's implied in the first phrase. If you're not allowed, of course you can prevent the other. The police can prevent it. So why do you need that? Why do you need that phrase? Next page. Mata'am, why? It's not redundant because now this is what they do a lot. They invent a hypothetical exchange between the worker and the landowner. I keep on saying the worker. It's a lessee. It's not right. Yeah, the serf, whatever. Yeah, because tenant farmer. Yeah, tenant farmer. Yeah. Because a worker is something else, so that's imprecise. It's imprecise when I say worker, although it ends up almost being the same thing in terms of labor law later in the Talmud. But here it's a tenant farmer. Okay, ma tam litzor. So eno rashai la'kor eno rashai litzor. What is the reason that in a place where you cut, you're not allowed to uproot, in a place where you uproot and you're not allowed to cut? Mishum d'shnehem ma'akvim ze al ze. Because each of the parties has a legitimate reason for cutting the other. So it goes as each party has a legitimate reason for stopping the other. So it goes back to the Talmud we just had, where it says because we can invent this kind of dialogue, that's why you have to actually say that one could prevent the other. Because you might think it's not allowed, okay? In this place it's not allowed, but because I might think that landowner has a legitimate reason, and I'm doing him a favor, like we talked about before, by uprooting, because that might enter my mind, therefore you have to invent this kind of dialogue where don't do me any favors, it's not the way I wanted it, and because of that dialogue, you actually have to say explicitly one can prevent the other. So one can go and stop the other person from doing it, because they each might have a benefit in maintaining the status quo of the place where they live. Yeah.
Yes, yeah. One of the trickiest things about contracts is a person can often assume something that isn't the case.
Right.
Yeah. I once had a bathroom floor replaced.
Yeah.
It was linoleum, and they didn't put in anything on the baseboard. I assumed, of course, what's going to hold the linoleum down if you don't have that strip? I've never seen a room that had it without that strip.
Quarter round.
Right.
Yeah.
So that was an incorrect assumption on my part, which I hadn't realized. But
specifying.
yeah.
Yeah. I one time a contractor threw in a sink, for free.
Right.
Just was, I had a sink, and it looks like you needed a sink, and it wasn't this kind of sink that we wanted.
Right.
Right. So doing me a favor, and it wasn't in the contract, and then it was just just pushing local custom and contract. You never know what the other person is really thinking.
Right.
So you stick to what's in
the. It's not something you normally do.
Right.
That's right. If the normal custom in your area is whatever.
Right. So you'll see a lot, and we've seen this before too, the idea of making sure the contract is really explicit enough. If it's not, don't make assumptions beyond the contract, and then you have to fall back on local custom. Was there another question? I thought so. Okay. All right, now the whole thing about plowing. Page 143, number 5. Lacharosh acharav yacharosh. Okay, and if the custom is to plow and plant afterwards, then you should do that. Pshita, okay, so it says it's obvious. It's obvious that should follow local custom. Since you told, why do you have to talk about plowing? You basically already made the point about local custom with cutting and uprooting, so why now with plowing? Okay, so this happens a lot. So why did you have to add plowing? How is plowing appreciably different from these other agricultural activities? So now they'll explain that it is. Lo, sricha, so you needed to mention plowing. Ba'atra de lo menakse. Because there are places. So what happens with plowing is, plowing you're also weeding, right? Because you're taking out stuff and you're putting in seeds. That's also so. There are places where where you might weed. So they would take out weeds while you're doing it. So I'm cutting, and then there's a period where you let the land rest for like a week, and then you do some weeding also. And you might think, okay, well then I just did the weeding for you, so I didn't really feel like I had to plow. So be'atra de lo menakse, where you're not weeding during plowing, but you're actually weeding during other times. So you might, okay, I already did the weeding for you. The azal ihu v'nachish, and that's when I weeded. So I didn't feel like I needed to plow afterwards, because I felt like all you really needed was the weeding, and I did the weeding in a different time, because that might occur to the worker. You actually have to have it explicit in the Mishnah. So don't just assume that all he wants in the plowing is the weeding. Don't assume anything. The custom is to plow. And since the worker might come up with a legitimate reason that might help the owner for not plowing, like I weeded at a different time, therefore you actually have to have the issue of plowing. Was that clear?
Yeah, I mean, it totally makes sense. It
Yeah.
comes down to the appropriate use of the land, and the local custom, as I read it, is
Yeah.
here's the right way to do it. You know, if we don't weed in this
Yeah.
season because we get a lot of torrential rains and
Right. The Graubart is right.
and the erosion is what does it. We do weed because we want to prep it for next year, and that's the way that the ultimate yield is going to be. So it really is. It seems pretty logical.
Okay, yeah. And now actually they just play out this dialogue. Mahu de tema lemar, because there could be this following dialogue. Hi, the fact that you weeded when you wanted to, de lo karev nale. It's not what I wanted. like you weeded when you thought it was appropriate. You're there on the land, but that's not the way we do things here.
Yeah.
And so I wanted it when you were plowing. That was my assumption. That's what it says in the Mishnah, and you messed it up. So therefore, because that dialogue could possibly happen, that's why you have to have it in the Mishnah. And I guess the idea is because there's different types of plowing. So just you follow the plowing of local custom. By the way, I mean that means anybody that comes and rents land, any tenant farmer, should be aware of local custom. And the question might be how do you make yourself aware of it? You have it's your obligation, absent anything more explicit in the contract, obviously. Yeah.
At that time, were tenant farmers, were they people who lived in the community?
Yeah,
They know
yeah.
local?
Yeah, I would think so.
They're not traveling.
Right, yeah. So I think at this time it's obviously not a secret what the local custom is. You go and you ask the other farmers, and you can figure it out. And Kamash Malan, so it teaches us the ibai le frushe le. It's so the overall lesson is that you have to explicitly, if you're going to change things, you have to explain it lefrusha ahead of time and put it in the contract. Otherwise, you're stuck with local custom. So you better understand local custom, and you can't deviate from it. Okay, so we'll do one more line.
Even if you come from Surah.
Even if you come from Surah, right? You're eating, right? Yeah. Well, that was, if you remember, that was one of the issues in that story is that it's local custom here. We don't eat that here, and he has an answer. He says that I was out of the city borders.
Right.
I made sure I was out of the city borders when I ate it.
Yeah, I don't know your custom. I'm from Surah.
Yeah. Well, not knowing the custom is actually not an excuse. And the fact is that he did know the custom. He did know the custom. So you have to follow local custom. Local custom is really important. So this is in agricultural, but also in Jewish law. I mean, in Jewish ritual, local custom is really important. It was much decentralized kind of governments in those days, and there were also cities that were very careful about. They wanted the respect of their local customs, just like we do. Yeah.
Ignorance is lost.
Yeah. All right. Now, if you remember, the last line of the Mishnah is Hakol Kamin Hagamidina. Everything follows the custom of where they are at. Now they're wondering about that word Hakol. Hakol latu emai. So Hakol, everything. Everything follows local custom. What does everything mean? Why do you even need the word everything? Because you already explained it's cutting or uprooting or plowing. Isn't that everything? Now, they're just wondering about that. Is there something else that we don't know about that you want to include in everything? It's a very vague statement, everything.
Just in case.
Yeah, so what, yeah. Well, everything, what does everything mean? And is there something specific that we're supposed to be thinking about that we're missing in reading the Mishnah that you're and is that why you're including that everything? And I'll just finish this. And then one explanation of everything, page 144. La tuiha, to include this. Ditnan Rabbanan. The rabbis taught. Makom shenahagu laskir ilanot al gabe karka. Okay, in a place where you're renting trees in addition to the land. Ilan maskirim. Makom she'ein nagu laskir ein maskirim. Okay, so there might be a case where basically it's wheat, but that's where the money crop is. But there happens to be trees on the field, and those trees have some fruit. So there could be local customs here. So in local customs, you get to keep all the fruit yourself. That could be a local custom. It's just you. Yeah, sure. I don't do anything with those apples. If you want to sell those apples, that's up to you. And that could be the local custom. Or the local custom could be whatever comes from the trees, we divide just like everything else. And so that would be an example of something else according to local custom. What do you do with trees? Now these aren't orchards. So orchards are things that you harvest and farm yourself, but there could be fruit trees or other things with trees that you can get some commercial value out of. And there's different customs about the tenant farmer's use of those. You have to follow local custom. Okay, we'll continue next time.